The Empty Jar, a Zen story for mental clarity and inner peace. In today's fast-paced world, our minds are constantly filled with thoughts, worries, and distractions that pull us away from true inner peace. This ancient story, passed down from master to student for generations in the Zen monasteries of the Far East, teaches us the profound art of emptying the mind to discover the serenity that has always been there, waiting to be uncovered. Join Kenji, a young monk seeking enlightenment, as he learns from his wise master Roshi the most important lesson of all, that only when we completely empty our mental jar can we fill it with the wisdom of the present moment. Through 8 chapters filled with profound teachings and moments of revelation, you'll discover how to free yourself from the weight of unnecessary thoughts and find that mental stillness that transforms every experience. This is not just a story to listen to, but an invitation to experience. Each chapter will guide you deeper into the state of empty mind that all Zen masters have sought throughout the centuries. Allow yourself to fully immerse in this narration, feeling how each word resonates within you and brings you closer to true mental peace. Prepare for a journey that will last 1 hour, but whose effects will extend far beyond, transforming your relationship with your thoughts and opening the doors to a serenity you thought impossible. Chapter 1. The Restless Student. In the misty mountains of Japan, where cherry blossoms whisper secrets to the wind and ancient temples rise like silent guardians of wisdom, lived a young monk named Kenji. His eyes gleamed with the restlessness of 1,000 questions, and his mind never rested, like a turbulent river carrying leaves without pause. Kenji had arrived at the Sojiji Zen monastery 3 years ago, seeking the enlightenment he had heard described in his childhood stories. But the more he meditated, the more agitated his thoughts became. While his fellow monks seemed to float in oceans of calm, he struggled in mental storms that left him exhausted. One autumn morning, when the leaves were beginning their golden dance to the earth, Kenji approached his master, Roshi Tanaka, an elder whose presence radiated the serenity of a still mountain lake. "Master," said Kenji, bowing respectfully, "I have meditated for hours, days, months, but my mind remains like a wild monkey jumping from branch to branch. How can I find the peace I see in you?" Roshi smiled with that gentleness possessed only by those who have found truth. "Kenji-san, come with me to the garden. There is something you must see." They walked in silence along gravel paths that crunched softly under their bare feet. The monastery garden was a poem written in stone and moss, where each element had been placed with the precision of a master's brushstroke. At the center, beside a pond that reflected clouds like a celestial mirror, stood a small bamboo table. "Sit," invited Roshi, and both took their places on cushions worn by years of contemplation. The master picked up a ceramic jar that rested on the table. It was a simple but beautiful piece, the color of earth after rain, with veins that looked like tiny rivers running across its surface. "This jar," said Roshi, holding it with reverence, "has been in this monastery for over 200 years. Do you know why we value it so much?" Kenji observed the jar, searching for something special about it. Sacred inscriptions, precious ornaments, some sign of its importance. But he found nothing exceptional. "No, master, it seems like an ordinary jar." "Exactly," murmured Roshi, and in his eyes sparked that light that appears when he's about to share a profound truth. "This jar is extraordinary precisely because it is completely empty. It contains no water, stores no rice, holds no treasures. Its emptiness is its greatest virtue." Kenji frowned, confused. "But master, what good is an empty jar? A full jar can quench thirst, satisfy hunger." "Ah," interrupted Roshi gently. "But tell me, young student, if this jar were full of sand, could we fill it with pure water when we were thirsty? If it were full of stones, would rice fit when we were hungry? If it were full of dirty water, could we put fresh flowers in it?" Kenji began to understand, but the complete truth still remained misty in his mind, like dawn barely peeking over the mountains. "Your mind, Kenji-san," continued Roshi, "is like this jar, but instead of being empty, it is completely full. Full of worries about tomorrow, memories of yesterday, judgments about the present, desires for what you don't have, fears of what you might lose. How can a mind that is already completely full be filled with peace? The young monk felt as if a fresh breeze had passed through his consciousness, carrying away some of the agitated leaves of his thoughts. "But master," he asked with a trembling voice, "how does one empty a mind? Thoughts come by themselves, like waves of the sea. I cannot stop them." Roshi slowly stood up, took the empty jar and submerged it in the pond. When he lifted it out, it overflowed with crystalline water that reflected the sky. "Do you see, Kenji? When the jar was empty, it could instantly be filled with this pure water. I didn't have to struggle against anything. I didn't have to force anything. I simply submerged it and it filled naturally." Then, before his student's attentive gaze, he slowly poured the jar until it was completely empty again. "So it must be with your mind. You must not fight thoughts as if they were enemies. You must not force emptiness. You simply must learn to tip your mental jar, allow it to empty, and then it can naturally fill with the peace of the present moment." As his master's words settled in his heart like seeds in fertile soil, Kenji felt for the first time in years a moment of true mental stillness. It was brief, like the space between two breaths, but it was real. "During this week," said Roshi, "I want you to come here every morning at dawn. You will simply sit with this empty jar and observe. Don't try to meditate, don't try to empty your mind by force. Just observe the jar and contemplate its perfect emptiness." Kenji nodded, feeling a strange mixture of hope and humility in his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like a failure on the spiritual path, but like a student who had received the first clue to a great mystery. As they returned to the monastery, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in golden and purple hues. In the quiet of twilight, Kenji could hear something that had always been there but his agitated mind had never perceived: the deep and peaceful sound of silence itself. That night, for the first time in months, he slept without his mind jumping from worry to worry. He had begun to understand that peace was not something he had to create, but something that already existed when he stopped creating so much mental noise. Chapter 2: Dawn Clouds. The first ray of sun barely caressed the snowy peaks when Kenji awoke. The monastery bell had not rung, but something within him had called with the softness of a morning breeze. He dressed in silence, without waking his cellmates, and walked barefoot through wooden corridors that creaked like old memories. The garden seemed like a different world at dawn. A subtle mist floated among the trees, and dewdrops on the leaves shone like small stars fallen from the sky. The pond reflected the slowly moving clouds, creating a second sky on earth. There was the bamboo table, and upon it, the empty jar waiting for him like an old friend. Kenji sat on the cushion and contemplated the object that had begun to change his perspective. At first, his mind did what it always did. It began to move like restless water. Thoughts about the day's tasks, memories of past conversations, questions about the future, all competed for his attention. But this time, instead of fighting them, he remembered his master's words and simply watched them pass, like clouds crossing the sky. "Don't try to meditate," he reminded himself. "Just observe the jar." The jar was extraordinarily simple. It had no elaborate decorations. It did not proclaim its importance with gold or jewels. Its beauty resided in its humility, in the way its open interior seemed to invite the entire universe to fill it. While observing, Kenji began to notice things he hadn't seen the day before. The way the morning light played on its surface, creating subtle shadows that gradually changed as the sun ascended. The manner in which the interior emptiness seemed to have its own presence, not as the absence of something, but as pure potential, as infinite possibility. "Good morning, young student." Roshi's soft voice didn't startle him. It was as if he had been waiting for him. "Good morning, master," Kenji responded without taking his gaze from the jar. Roshi sat beside him in silence. Together they contemplated the empty jar while the world slowly awakened around them. Birds began their morning chorus, and lotus flowers in the pond opened like hands offering themselves to the sky. After a long moment, the master spoke. "Tell me, Kenji-san, what have you observed?" "The jar remains the same, master, but I see different things each time I look at it." as if my way of seeing were changing. Ah, murmured Roshi with approval. The empty jar is a perfect teacher. It never preaches, never argues, never tries to convince you of anything. It simply is what it is, and in its simplicity, it teaches us everything we need to know. He took the jar in his wrinkled hands and lifted it toward the light. Do you see how light passes through it without obstacles? If it were filled with solid objects, light could not penetrate it. But empty as it is, it becomes transparent, allows light to flow freely. Kenji felt a deep connection with those words. His mind, always so full of dense thoughts, had never allowed the light of clarity to pass through it. Master, he said softly, when I observe the jar, sometimes I feel moments where my mind becomes silent. It's not that I stop thinking completely, but thoughts don't disturb me as much. It's as if I could see them pass without clinging to them. Roshi smiled, and in his smile was the warmth of 1,000 suns. Those moments, Kenji-san, are small tastes of the great emptiness. They are not the final destination, but signs on the path showing you that you're going in the right direction. They are like the first raindrops announcing the arrival of the monsoon. The master stood and walked toward the pond. He took some water in his cupped palms and returned. Extend your hands, he asked Kenji. When the young monk extended his palms upward, Roshi slowly poured the water from his hands into his students. The water remained there for a moment, forming a small crystalline pool. Now, said Roshi, close your fists. The moment Kenji closed his hands, the water slipped between his fingers, falling back to the earth. Thoughts are like this water, explained the master. If you keep your mind open and relaxed, like your extended palms, thoughts can be there without causing you disturbance. But if you try to grasp them, control them, close your mind like tight fists, they slip away and leave you with empty hands and a frustrated heart. Kenji contemplated his wet palms, feeling the truth of the teaching in the depths of his being. During your practice, continued Roshi, don't try to catch mental emptiness like it were a butterfly. Emptiness is not something that can be possessed. It's more like the space in this jar. It's always there, patiently waiting for us to stop filling it with unnecessary things. As he spoke, the clouds above them moved slowly, changing shapes effortlessly. One looked like a dragon, then transformed into a mountain, then into an ocean of white cotton. Look at the clouds, pointed Roshi. They are in constant change, but the sky that contains them remains unchanging. Your thoughts are like those clouds, always changing, always moving, but the consciousness that observes them, that is like the sky, vast, unchanging, always present. Kenji looked up and contemplated the blue sky extending infinitely beyond the passing clouds. For a moment, he felt a deep identification with that vastness, as if his mind expanded beyond the limits of his skull, becoming the very space where thoughts appeared and disappeared. The empty jar, murmured Roshi, returning the sacred object to its place, teaches us that emptiness is not absence of life, but total presence of possibility. When your mind is truly empty, you will not be unconscious or asleep. You will be more awake than ever, because finally you will be able to perceive reality without the distortions of your constant thoughts. The sun had risen enough for its golden rays to completely illuminate the garden. Colors became more vibrant, sounds clearer, and Kenji could perceive a quality of presence in everything around him that he had never noticed before. Come tomorrow at the same time, said Roshi as he prepared to leave. And remember, don't come to achieve something. Come simply to be with the empty jar. Allow it to be your teacher, and you will discover that the best student is one who doesn't try to learn, but simply remains open to what is already present. When Kenji finally stood to return to his morning duties, he carried with him something more than new information. He carried a direct experience, though brief, of what it felt like to be as spacious as the sky, as receptive as the empty jar, as natural as flowing water. The day passed differently. While performing his tasks sweeping corridors, helping in the kitchen, copying sutras, he noticed he could maintain a quality of mental openness. as if a small part of him always remained connected to that sensation of spaciousness he had experienced in the garden. It wasn't perfect, and many times his old mind returned with its habitual patterns. But now he knew there was something more, a different possibility of being in the world. And that made all the difference. Chapter 3. The River That Does Not Cling. The third dawn came accompanied by gentle rain that created a hypnotic rhythm on the temple tiles. Kenji awakened to the sound of water kissing the earth, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the immediate urge to plan his day or worry about his tasks. There was something in the sound of rain that seemed to also wash away the anxious thoughts from his mind. When he arrived at the garden, he found that the rain had transformed the space into an even more intimate sanctuary. Raindrops danced on the pond's surface, creating concentric circles that expanded and vanished like momentary thoughts. The empty jar on the bamboo table glistened with moisture, seeming more alive than ever. Kenji sat under the eave that protected the table, close enough to stay dry but still feeling the fresh presence of rain. He contemplated the jar, noticing how the drops that had accumulated on its exterior surface slowly rolled down without leaving a trace. Even under the rain, it remains empty, he thought. The water touches it, but doesn't cling to it. His reflections were interrupted by the familiar sound of Roshi's approaching footsteps. The master arrived with a large lotus leaf over his head as a natural umbrella, his robe barely damp despite the rain. "I see that not even rain can keep you from your appointment with Emptiness," said Roshi with an amused smile as he settled beside Kenji. "The rain makes everything seem clearer, Master, as if it were washing not only the garden, but also my mind." Roshi nodded approvingly. Rain is a perfect Zen teacher. It falls without discrimination on the pure and impure, on the beautiful and ugly, on the sacred and ordinary. It doesn't judge, doesn't choose, it simply is. Both remained in silence, listening to the rain's gentle symphony. Kenji noticed his mind was remarkably quieter than previous days. Thoughts still came, but they seemed less sticky, less urgent, like raindrops that touched the jar and then slid off without adhering. "Master," he finally said, "I've noticed something strange these past days. When I look at the jar, sometimes I feel as if I too were empty, as if there were no solid I observing. It's a strange but liberating sensation." Roshi took the jar in his hands, allowing some raindrops to fall into its interior. "Do you see this?" he asked, pointing to the drops now resting at the bottom of the jar. "Now there's water in the jar, but has the jar lost its empty nature?" Kenji observed carefully. "No. The space is still there. The water is in the emptiness, but the emptiness hasn't disappeared." "Exactly. Your true nature is like the emptiness of this jar. Thoughts, emotions, experiences are like these raindrops. They can appear in your consciousness, but they don't destroy your fundamental spacious nature. The problem arises when we identify with the drops instead of recognizing ourselves as the space that contains them." Roshi gently tilted the jar, allowing the drops to return to the pond. "Where did the drops go?" he asked. "They returned to the water, Master." "And where were they before being drops?" Kenji contemplated the question. "Also in the water. So it is with your thoughts. They appear from the emptiness of your consciousness and return to the same emptiness. They were never really separated from it. The error is believing we are the temporary drops instead of recognizing ourselves as the ocean of consciousness from which they arise." At that moment, a bird landed on the pond's edge to drink. Its reflection formed perfectly on the water's surface. But when it flew away, the reflection disappeared without leaving a trace. The water remained as clear and pure as before. "Did you see that?" pointed Roshi. The pond completely received the bird's image, but when the bird left, not even a shadow of its presence remained. The water didn't cling to the reflection, didn't try to preserve it, didn't anguish over its departure. Kenji felt a deep understanding resonate in his chest. Our mind should be like that pond. Yes, receptive to everything that comes, but without clinging to anything that goes. When a beautiful thought appears, we receive it completely. When a painful thought arises, we also receive it without resistance. And when either of them leaves, we let them go without struggling to retain them. Roshi stood and walked to the eave's edge, extending his hand to receive the raindrops. "Come here, Kenji-san." The young monk approached his master, who took his hand and placed it also under the rain. "Feel the drops falling on your palm. Each one is unique. Each one touches your skin differently. But none stays permanently. They arrive, you feel them completely, and then they leave. This is how your relationship with all the contents of your mind should be." While Kenji felt the rain on his palm, he experienced an extraordinary sensation of fluidity. It was as if the boundary between him and the external world had become porous, permeable. There wasn't a solid, I receiving separate experiences, but rather a continuous flow of consciousness in which everything appeared and disappeared naturally. "This is the difference between the river and the rock," continued Roshi. "The rock resists the water, creates turbulence, erodes slowly. But the river flows around every obstacle without losing its nature. It doesn't fight with the stones in its path. It simply embraces them and continues flowing." "How can I be more like the river, master?" "By not trying to be one," replied Roshi with a gentle laugh. "The river doesn't decide to be a river, doesn't practice being a river, doesn't strive to be a river. It simply flows according to its nature. Your true nature is already like the river, fluid, adaptable, without resistance. You only need to stop pretending to be the rock." They returned to their seats under the eave. The rain continued its gentle dance, and Kenji felt as if each drop was washing away layers of mental tension he had accumulated over years. "Master, when I'm with the empty jar, sometimes I feel time stops, as if hours pass, but only minutes have gone by." "Time," said Roshi, "is created by the mind that jumps from past to future. When the mind settles completely in the present, time reveals itself for what it really is. A useful illusion, but not fundamental reality. In true emptiness, only this eternal moment exists, always present, always fresh." As he spoke, the clouds began to open slightly, allowing rays of sunlight to penetrate the rain, creating a faint rainbow over the garden. "Look," pointed Roshi. "Rain and sun don't fight each other. Their encounter creates beauty. When you learn not to fight your thoughts, when you learn to remain empty like this jar, you'll discover that even the most difficult thoughts can create rainbows in your consciousness." Kenji contemplated the rainbow, feeling deep gratitude for this teaching so subtle yet powerful. He was beginning to understand that emptying the mind didn't mean having a dead or inert mind, but a mind as spacious and flexible as the sky, which could contain any weather without being disturbed. "Continue coming each morning," said Roshi as he prepared to leave. "But now also carry this teaching with you during the day. Remember that you are the pond, not the reflections. The sky, not the clouds. The jar, not its contents. And when you forget, because you will forget many times, simply return to the breath, return to the present moment, return to the emptiness naturally present in the center of your being." When Kenji finally returned to his activities, the rain had ceased, but he carried with him that sensation of fluidity and openness. It was as if he had learned a new language, the language of non-clinging, of allowing, of being like water that takes the shape of the container but never loses its essence. Chapter 4. The Mirror of Consciousness. The fourth dawn arrived crystalline and silent. The air was so still that the pond seemed like a perfect sheet of glass, reflecting every cloud, every leaf, every stone with absolute clarity. Kenji arrived at the garden feeling an inner stillness that almost matched the external stillness of the morning world. He sat before the empty jar, but this time his approach was different. Instead of observing it as an external object, he felt a strange sensation of recognition, as if he were seeing a reflection of something familiar in the depths of himself. "Good morning, old friend," he murmured, surprising himself by addressing the jar this way. While contemplating its simple surface and spacious interior, Kenji noticed his mind wasn't jumping from thought to thought like before. Thoughts still appeared, but there were spaces between them, moments of pure emptiness where there was no mental content, only a clear and alert presence. I see you've begun to make friends with emptiness, said a familiar voice behind him. Roshi approached with a grace that seemed not to disturb the morning silence, as if he were part of the landscape itself. He carried something in his hands, a small polished bronze mirror, so ancient its surface had the golden patina of centuries. Master, greeted Kenji without completely removing his attention from the jar. I feel something is changing in me. It's as if there were more space inside my head. Roshi sat and placed the mirror next to the jar on the bamboo table. The space was always there, Kenji-san. It was just so full of mental furniture that you couldn't perceive it. It's like a room so cluttered you forget how spacious it really is. He took the mirror in his hands and oriented it toward Kenji. Look at yourself in this mirror. What do you see? Kenji leaned forward and observed his reflection. I see my face, Master. Is your face really inside the mirror? Kenji contemplated the question, feeling there was something deeper in it. No, my face is here. The mirror only reflects its image. Exactly. Now observe. Roshi moved the mirror slightly so it reflected the sky. What do you see now? The sky and clouds. Is the sky inside the mirror? No, the mirror only reflects it. Roshi oriented the mirror toward the empty jar. The jar's image appeared perfectly reflected in the burnished surface. And now what do you see? The empty jar reflected in the mirror. Is the jar inside the mirror? Is its emptiness inside the mirror? Kenji meditated on this. No. The mirror simply reflects what's in front of it, without adding or removing anything. Now understand this, said Roshi with a soft but penetrating voice. Your consciousness is like this mirror. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, all experiences appear in it like reflections. But just as the mirror doesn't become blue when it reflects the sky, nor break when it reflects a breaking stone, your true consciousness is never really touched by what it reflects. Kenji felt a revelation blooming within him like a lotus flower opening at dawn. Then, all my sufferings, all my worries, all the thoughts I believed were me, are only temporary reflections in the unchanging mirror of your consciousness, completed Roshi. The problem arises when we identify with the reflections instead of recognizing ourselves as the mirror itself. To demonstrate his point, Roshi took a handful of moist earth from the garden and threw it at the mirror. The surface became stained and opaque. What has happened to the mirror? He asked. It's gotten dirty. It can't reflect clearly. But has the mirror's nature changed? Has it stopped being a mirror? Kenji observed more carefully. No, it's still a mirror. It's just temporarily obstructed. Roshi took a soft cloth and carefully cleaned the surface until it shone like before, perfectly clear and reflective. This is what happens with your mind. Habitual thoughts, judgments, worries are like the mud that stains the mirror of your consciousness. But the mirror's nature, its capacity to reflect with perfect clarity, is never really damaged, can always be cleaned. And how is the mirror of consciousness cleaned, Master? Instead of answering directly, Roshi placed the clean mirror in front of the empty jar again. What effort does the mirror make to reflect the jar? None. It simply reflects. What effort does it make to stop reflecting it when the jar moves? Also no effort. It automatically stops reflecting what's no longer in front of it. There's your answer. The mirror of consciousness cleans itself when we stop interfering with its natural function. When we stop clinging to reflections, when we stop resisting what appears, when we stop pretending to be the temporary reflections, natural clarity restores itself. Kenji contemplated both the mirror and the jar, feeling how these two teachings intertwined in his understanding. The jar had taught him about fertile emptiness. Now the mirror taught him about the clear consciousness that could contain that emptiness. Master, when I observe the empty jar now, it's as if I were seeing my own nature reflected. Very good, smiled Roshi. You're beginning to recognize that there's really no difference between the observer and the observed, between the mirror and what it reflects, between consciousness and emptiness. They are aspects of the same indivisible reality. At that moment, a gentle breeze moved the branches of a nearby cherry tree, and pink petals began to fall like perfumed snow. Some fell in the pond, creating concentric ripples. Others fell on the table, including one that settled delicately on the edge of the empty jar. "Observe," pointed Roshi. "The petal rests on the jar, but the jar doesn't stop being empty. The petal reflects in the pond, but the pond doesn't stop being water. The breeze moves the leaves, but the space through which they move remains motionless." Kenji felt a deep peace settling within him. It was as if all the layers of false identification he had carried for years were gently dissolving, leaving only a simple and natural presence. "This is what the ancient masters called mirror mind," continued Roshi. "A consciousness so clear and empty that it perfectly reflects everything that arises, without distortion, without judgment, without clinging. And also what they called Buddha nature, this innate capacity to remain awake and present regardless of what temporary reflections appear. Do we all have this nature, master? All are this nature, Kenji-san. It's not something you have, it's something you are. The problem is we're so fascinated with the reflections that we forget we are the mirror. We're so entertained with the jar's contents that we forget we are the emptiness that contains them." Roshi stood and began walking slowly around the table, carrying the mirror with him. "During today," he said, "practice being aware of this mirror nature. When a strong thought arises, ask yourself, who is observing this thought? When you feel an intense emotion, ask yourself, what remains unchanging while this emotion changes? When you have a pleasant or painful experience, ask yourself, what is the consciousness that can know both pleasure and pain without being either?" Kenji nodded, feeling these questions resonating in something very deep in his being. "And remember," added Roshi as he prepared to leave, "the mirror has no preferences. It doesn't prefer reflecting beautiful flowers instead of ugly garbage. It simply reflects everything with perfect equanimity. When you can be like this mirror, open to all experience without clinging to any, you will have found the freedom you seek." After Roshi left, Kenji remained seated in contemplation. He took the mirror in his hands and oriented it in different directions, observing how it faithfully reflected everything presented before it. His own face, the changing sky, the garden flowers, the empty jar. Gradually, he began to feel a deep identification not with what he saw in the mirror, but with the quality of being present and alert that made all perception possible. It was like discovering he had been an actor so absorbed in his role that he had forgotten he was the conscious space in which the entire play took place. For the first time in his life, Kenji experienced what it meant to be completely present without being anyone in particular, completely conscious without clinging to any content of consciousness. It was a freedom so vast and natural that he wondered how he could have ignored it for so long. When he finally returned to his daily duties, he carried with him not only a new conceptual understanding, but a direct experience of his most fundamental nature. And although this clarity would cloud and clear many times during the day, he now knew without doubt that beneath all the fluctuations of his experience, there was something unchanging, peaceful, and completely free. Chapter 5: The Dance of Being and Non-Being. On the fifth day, Kenji awakened before dawn with a strange sense of expectation, as if something important was about to reveal itself. The pre-dawn air had a special quality, charged with that subtle electricity that precedes great internal transformations. When he arrived at the garden, he was surprised to find Roshi already there, sitting in deep meditation before the empty jar. His presence was so serene, he seemed to merge with the morning stillness. Kenji approached silently and sat beside him, without interrupting the master's meditation. In the pre-dawn dimness, the empty jar seemed to be more than a physical object. There was something in its simplicity that transcended form, as if it were a door to something infinite. Kenji contemplated it, noticing his perception had changed dramatically in these few days. He no longer saw simply a ceramic jar, but a living symbol of his own essential nature. After an indeterminate time, it could have been minutes or hours, Roshi gently opened his eyes. "Good morning, Kenji-san. I see the empty jar is calling you earlier and earlier." "Good morning, master. There's something about it. It's as if it were teaching me without words." Roshi smiled with that expression of someone who recognizes the ripening of understanding in his student. "Today," he said, "I want to show you the deepest mystery of the empty jar. But first, tell me, does the jar really exist?" Kenji touched the ceramic's cold surface. "Of course it exists, master. I can touch it, see it." "Ah, but what exactly exists? Does the clay it's made of exist?" "Yes. And before being a jar, where was this clay?" Kenji reflected. "In the earth, in the mountains. And before being clay, it was rock minerals. And before being rock, it was stardust elements forged in the heart of ancient suns." "Exactly. So where does the jar end and the universe begin?" "Where does the universe end and the jar begin?" Kenji felt his conceptual mind beginning to sway gently, like a house of cards touched by an invisible breeze. "Now," continued Roshi, "tell me, does the jar's emptiness really exist?" "Well, emptiness is the absence of things, so in a certain sense it doesn't exist. But can you put water in something that doesn't exist?" "No." "Then emptiness must exist in some way. But how can something that is the absence of everything exist?" Kenji immersed himself in deep contemplation. It was like trying to grasp water with his hands. Every time he thought he had a solid answer, it slipped through his fingers of thought. "This," said Roshi gently, "is what the ancient masters called the dance of being and non-being. The jar exists and doesn't exist. Emptiness exists and doesn't exist. You exist and don't exist. Everything in this universe is in this mysterious dance between existence and non-existence." To illustrate his point, Roshi took a handful of fine sand from the nearby Zen garden and let it fall slowly between his fingers. "Do you see these grains of sand? Each one seems separate and solid. But if you observe them with a microscope, you'll see they're made of molecules. Observe the molecules and you'll see atoms. Observe the atoms and you'll see empty space with tiny particles dancing. Observe the particles and you'll see they appear and disappear from the quantum vacuum. So what's real? The grains of sand or the emptiness from which they emerge?" Kenji contemplated the grains of sand that had fallen on the table, noticing how the dawn light made them shine like small stars. "The answer," continued Roshi, "is that both are equally real and equally illusory. They are different aspects of the same fundamental reality that is beyond being and non-being." At that moment, the sun appeared above the mountains, bathing the garden in golden light. The empty jar glowed softly, and Kenji had a sudden and astonishing perception. He could see simultaneously the jar's apparent solidity and its fundamental emptiness, its existence and its non-existence, without these perceptions contradicting each other. "Master," he murmured in an amazed voice, "I can see that the jar is there and not there at the same time. It's as if it were solid and empty, real and unreal simultaneously." "Excellent!" exclaimed Roshi with genuine joy. "You've begun to see with what we call empty vision, the ability to perceive the paradoxical nature of all existence. Now apply this vision to yourself." Kenji directed his attention toward his own experience. Immediately, he could feel the same paradox in his own being. He was there as Kenji the monk with his history, his thoughts, his emotions. But simultaneously, there was a deep sensation of not being anyone in particular, of being as empty and spacious as the jar itself. "It's extraordinary," he whispered. "I can feel that I am Kenji and that there is no Kenji. I can feel my thoughts and also the total absence of a thinker. It's as if I were everything and nothing at the same time. This is what the sacred texts call the empty nature of all phenomena," explained Roshi. "It doesn't mean nothing exists, but that nothing exists in the solid and independent way we believe. Everything is like a rainbow, vivid and beautiful when it appears, but without solid substance when you examine it closely." Roshi stood and walked toward the pond, where koi fish swam lazily in slow circles. "Come here, Kenji-san." When Kenji approached, Roshi threw a small stone into the center of the pond. Waves expanded in perfect circles, temporarily disturbing the reflection of the clouds. "Where is the stone now?" he asked. "At the bottom of the pond." And the waves it created? They're expanding toward the edges. But where are the waves really? Are they different from the water? Kenji observed carefully. The waves are just movement in the water. They're not separate from the water. They are the water moving. Exactly. Waves have no independent existence from water, but they're also not identical to all the water. They are a temporary expression of water. In the same way, you are like a wave in the infinite ocean of consciousness. You're not separate from consciousness, but you're also not identical to it in its totality. You are a unique and temporary expression of something vast and nameless. This metaphor resonated deeply in Kenji. He could feel viscerally how his individual sense of self was like a wave real in its manifestation, but not separated from the ocean of being from which it arose. "Now understand," said Roshi as they returned toward the table, "why the empty jar is the perfect teacher. It teaches you simultaneously about form and emptiness, existence and non-existence, self and no self. It shows you that these are not contradictory opposites, but complementary aspects of the same indescribable reality." They sat again before the jar, but now Kenji's experience was completely different. He was no longer a subject observing an object. It was more like consciousness recognizing itself through multiple forms: Kenji's form, the jar's form, Roshi's form, the garden's form, but being fundamentally one. "This understanding," continued Roshi, "is what frees from suffering. When you realize that both you and your problems are like waves in water, real but not solid, meaningful but not permanent, you stop fighting life and begin to flow with it. Master, how can I maintain this vision during daily activities? It's so easy to forget and return to believing I'm solidly real." "Practice," responded Roshi, "consists of regularly remembering this paradoxical nature. When you feel very solid and separate, remember emptiness. When you feel too empty or disconnected, remember form. The empty jar teaches you to dance between these two aspects without clinging to either." The sun had risen enough to gently warm their faces. In the new light, everything in the garden seemed to shine with a translucent quality, as if it were solid and ethereal at the same time. "During today," instructed Roshi, "practice seeing everything with this dual vision. See the apparent solidity of things and simultaneously their empty nature. See your own reality as a person and simultaneously your nature as conscious space. Don't try to resolve the paradox intellectually. Simply allow both perceptions to coexist." As Roshi prepared to leave, Kenji felt immense gratitude for being guided to such profound understanding. It was as if he had been living in a two-dimensional world and suddenly had discovered the third dimension. "One more thing," said Roshi before leaving. "Don't cling to this special experience. Two is empty. True freedom comes when you can be extraordinary without clinging to the extraordinary, when you can be ordinary without rejecting the ordinary. The empty jar is special precisely because it is completely ordinary." When Kenji finally stood to continue with his day, he carried with him a new way of seeing that would forever transform his relationship with reality. He had learned to dance between being and non-being, to exist fully without clinging to existence, to be completely human while recognizing his unchanging nature beyond the human. Chapter 6. The Sound of Silence. On the sixth morning, Kenji experienced something completely unexpected. He awakened not with a sense of anticipation or curiosity, but with a stillness so deep it seemed there was silence even before his thoughts began to form. It was as if the practice of previous days had created a space of calm that now extended even to his sleep. When he arrived at the garden, he found the most silent scene he had ever experienced. There was no breeze moving the leaves, no birds singing, not even the distant murmur of other monks awakening. It was as if the entire world had decided to keep silence for this particular lesson. The empty jar on the table seemed to radiate this silence, as if it were both its source and destination. Kenji sat before it and immediately noticed something extraordinary. His mind was almost completely quiet. There wasn't the usual stream of thoughts, nor the familiar urgency to analyze or plan. There was only an alert and spacious presence, like a mountain lake on a windless morning. "Can you hear it?" Roshi's soft voice arose from the silence without disturbing it, as if it were part of it. "Hear what, master?" whispered Kenji, instinctively keeping the volume low so as not to break the sacred quality of the moment. The sound of silence. Kenji listened attentively. At first, he only perceived the absence of sound. But the more deeply he listened, he began to detect something subtle. Not exactly a sound, but rather the living presence of silence itself, as if it were music so refined it was beyond the range of ordinary hearing. "It's strange, master. I don't hear any sound, but there's something there," as if silence were alive. Roshi sat beside him, and his presence merged so naturally with the stillness that it was difficult to say where the master ended and silence began. "True silence," murmured Roshi, "is not the mere absence of noise. It is the presence of something more fundamental than any sound. It is the conscious space in which all sounds appear and disappear, but which itself is never disturbed by any sound." To demonstrate his point, Roshi took a small bronze bell he had brought and rang it softly. The clear, pure tone extended through the garden, filling the air with its crystalline resonance. Then, gradually, the sound faded until it disappeared completely. "Where did the sound go?" asked Roshi. "It faded into silence." "And where did it come from?" Kenji contemplated this. From silence too. Yes, sound arises from silence and returns to silence. But silence remains unaltered, whether there is sound or not. It's like space that contains both the presence and absence of objects, but which itself is never present nor absent. Roshi rang the bell several more times, each time allowing Kenji to observe how sound emerged from silence and dissolved back into it, without the fundamental silence ever being altered. "Your true mind," continued the master, "is like this silence. Thoughts arise from it and return to it, but the silent consciousness that you fundamentally are is never disturbed by any thought, no matter how noisy or disturbing it may be." Kenji felt a deep understanding resonating within him. During all these days of contemplating the empty jar, he had been learning to identify not with the contents of his experience, but with the silent space in which all experience appeared. "Master, when I'm in this silence, it's as if I were more myself than ever, but at the same time as if I weren't anyone in particular." "Exactly. You've found your original nature, the silent consciousness that is before identity, before thought, before any experience, but which makes possible all identity, all thought, all experience." Roshi stood and walked slowly around the table, carrying the bell with him. His steps were so silent he seemed to float over the gravel. "In ancient texts," he said while walking, "this silence is called many names. The original mind, Buddha nature, the nameless Tao, the Supreme Self. But all these names point to the same fundamental reality, the silent consciousness that you are before being anyone in particular." He stopped behind Kenji and rang the bell directly above his head. The sound seemed to penetrate not only his ears, but every cell of his body, and then faded into an even deeper silence than before. "Did you notice something special about the silence that followed the sound?" asked Roshi. Kenji reflected. "Yes. It was as if the silence were more intense, more present after the sound. That's because the contrast with sound allowed you to perceive the presence of silence more clearly. Similarly, sometimes we need the contrast with noisy thoughts to fully appreciate the silence of our true nature." Roshi returned to his seat and placed the bell next to the empty jar. "Look at these two objects," he instructed. "The jar has taught you about emptiness that can contain anything. The bell teaches you about silence that can contain any sound. But both point to the same truth, your nature as the empty and silent conscious space in which all experience appears." Kenji contemplated both objects, feeling how they represented complementary aspects of the same profound teaching. The jar showed the spaciousness of his being. The bell revealed the silence of his essence. "During the coming days," continued Roshi, "I want you to practice listening to this silence throughout the day. No matter how noisy the external world becomes, you can always find this fundamental silence if you listen deeply enough. It's like finding the motionless eye in the center of a hurricane." "But how can I listen to silence when there's so much noise, master?" Don't listen to the sounds, replied Roshi. Listen to what listens to the sounds. Don't focus on thoughts. Focus on what knows the thoughts. That silent consciousness which is the knower of all experience. That is your true nature. To illustrate this, Roshi began speaking louder, then softer, then in whispers, and finally maintained complete silence. During all these changes, he asked Kenji to notice what remained constant. What did you notice that didn't change during all those different levels of sound? The consciousness that was listening, that remained the same, regardless of whether you spoke loud, soft, or in silence. Perfect. That silent consciousness is what you really are. Sounds come and go, thoughts come and go, emotions come and go, but the silent consciousness that knows them all remains unchanging. At that moment, as if it had been waiting for the perfect signal, a bird began to sing in a nearby tree. Its melody was exquisitely beautiful, filling the garden with pure and joyful trills. But instead of disturbing the silence they had been exploring, it seemed to emerge from it and enhance it, like jewels against black velvet. Do you see? Smiled Roshi. True silence is not disturbed by sound. In fact, it makes sound more beautiful, more present, more appreciated. When you rest in your silent nature, you don't become deaf to the world. You become the perfect listener, capable of appreciating every sound fully without being disturbed by any. Kenji experienced exactly this. He could hear the bird's song with extraordinary clarity and beauty, but from a place of silence so deep that the sound seemed to be happening within an infinite space of peace. This silence, continued Roshi while the bird continued singing, is also why the empty jar is the perfect teacher. In its material silence, it points toward the silence of consciousness. In its physical emptiness, it signals the conscious emptiness that you are. It makes no noise, doesn't argue, doesn't try to convince you of anything. It simply is, and in its simple being, it reveals your simple being. Master, I feel as if I had been searching for something all my life, and now I realize it was this silence that has always been here. Yes, nodded Roshi with deep satisfaction. You've been searching in the wrong place. You've been seeking peace in noisy experiences, seeking fulfillment in empty objects, seeking your true nature in false identities. But your real home has always been this present silence, this conscious emptiness, this peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. The bird finished its song and flew away, leaving the garden once again in physical silence. But now this silence was different for Kenji. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the fully recognized presence of his own essential nature. Carry this silence with you wherever you go, instructed Roshi as he prepared to leave. It's always available, always present, always offering refuge and peace. When the world becomes too noisy, when your thoughts become too agitated, when your emotions become too turbulent, simply return to this silence. It's your eternal anchor in the ever-changing ocean of experience. When Kenji finally stood to continue with his duties, he carried with him not only a new understanding, but a new way of being in the world. He was no longer someone who occasionally experienced moments of silence, but someone who permanently inhabited silence and occasionally experienced moments of noise. This inversion of perspective would change everything in his spiritual practice and daily life. Chapter 7: The Silent Revolution. The seventh morning arrived with a storm. Not an external storm, the sky remained clear and serene, but an internal storm in Kenji's experience. During the night he had had vivid and disturbing dreams, and he awakened with his mind more agitated than it had been in days. It was as if all the old patterns of thought had returned with vengeance, trying to reclaim their mental territory. As he walked toward the garden, his mind jumped frantically from worry to worry. Had he been deceiving himself about his progress? Was this peace he had experienced real, or was he just convincing himself? What would happen when he had to face real challenges in life? When he arrived at the table where the empty jar waited, he sat with a sense of defeat. The deep silence of previous days seemed to have disappeared, replaced by the familiar chaos of anxious thoughts. I see that the inner storm has arrived, said Roshi, appearing silently as always. Master, said Kenji with a discouraged voice. "All the progress I thought I had made seems to have vanished. My mind is as agitated as ever. Maybe I'm not capable of this practice." Roshi sat beside him, his presence emanating that unshakable calm that seemed immune to any turbulence. "Ah," he smiled. "You've reached the most important point in your training. What you're experiencing now is what we call the silent revolution, the moment when your old way of being makes its last great attempt to survive." He took the empty jar and placed it directly in front of Kenji. "Tell me, when you fill this jar with dirty water and then empty it, does the jar remain contaminated forever?" "No, master. Once emptied, it returns to being clean. And if you fill it with poison and then empty it, it also returns to being clean. And if you fill it with liquid gold and then empty it, the same, it returns to being empty and clean. Then," continued Roshi with infinite patience, "why do you think your consciousness would be different? Why do you think being temporarily filled with anxious thoughts would permanently contaminate it?" Kenji contemplated this analogy, feeling how a small light began to make its way through the clouds of his despair. "But master, these thoughts feel so real, so urgent." "Of course they do. But tell me, when you dream at night, don't the dream experiences feel real and urgent while you're dreaming?" "Yes. And what happens to those urgent realities when you wake up? They're revealed as illusions, as creations of my mind." "Exactly. What you're experiencing now is awakening from a much deeper dream, the dream of believing you are your thoughts, that you are your mental agitation, that you are the storm instead of being the sky that contains it." To illustrate his point, Roshi took a handful of dry leaves from the ground and threw them into the air. The wind lifted them and made them spin in chaotic whirlwinds around them. "Is the air disturbed by this dance of leaves?" he asked. Kenji observed the spinning leaves. "No, the air remains still. The leaves move through it, but it doesn't move with them. Your true consciousness is like this air. Thoughts, no matter how urgent and convincing they may be, are like these leaves. They can dance through the space of your consciousness, but they cannot really disturb it. The disturbance you feel is only the result of identifying with the leaves instead of recognizing yourself as the space." As the leaves gradually settled, Roshi continued, "This inner storm you're experiencing is actually a very positive sign. It means you've touched something so authentic in yourself that all false patterns of identification are being challenged. It's like when you clean a room that has been closed for years. First, a lot of dust gets stirred up, but that's a necessary part of the cleaning process." Kenji felt profound relief hearing this. Instead of being evidence of his failure, his current agitation was a natural part of the awakening process. "Now," said Roshi, taking the empty jar again, "I want you to do something different. Instead of trying to fight these agitated thoughts, or trying to recreate the peace of previous days, simply allow all this mental storm to be present in the empty space of your consciousness." "How do I do that, master?" "Imagine your consciousness is like this jar, but infinitely spacious. Now, allow all your anxious thoughts, all your doubts, all your fears to be like water poured into this infinite jar. No matter how much water you pour into something infinitely spacious, there will always be more space." Kenji closed his eyes and tried to follow this instruction. At first, thoughts seemed to resist being contained this way, but gradually, he began to experience a sensation of internal vastness that could accommodate any amount of mental agitation without being overwhelmed by it. "It's extraordinary," he murmured. "I can feel all the anxiety and confusion, but there's something larger that contains them. It's as if I were an ocean so vast it can contain any storm." Exactly. This is the difference between resisting your internal states and completely receiving them. Resistance creates suffering. Total reception creates freedom. No matter how intense the experience, there's always more space in you to contain it. Roshi stood and walked toward the pond, where koi fish swam tranquilly despite some leaves having fallen on the surface. "Do you see these fish?" he pointed. "They're not disturbed by the leaves floating on the surface. They continue swimming in the pond's depths. You too have these depths, layers of your being that remain in perfect peace, regardless of what storms may be agitating the surface. Kenji opened his eyes and contemplated the pond, feeling a deep connection with this metaphor. He could sense there were levels of his consciousness that remained completely untouched by his current mental agitation. The silent revolution, continued Roshi as he returned, doesn't consist of making your mind be quiet by force. It consists of discovering the silence that's already there, in the depths of your being, patiently waiting to be recognized. But how do I access those depths when the surface is so agitated? Don't try to access them, replied Roshi with an enigmatic smile. Simply recognize that you're already in them. The agitation you feel is happening on the surface of something infinitely deeper and quieter. It's like being at the bottom of the ocean and worrying about waves that are far above on the surface. To demonstrate this, Roshi took a stone and threw it into the center of the pond. Waves expanded in circles, disturbing the reflection of clouds. But at the bottom, fish continued swimming unaffected. Your practice now, he instructed, is not trying to calm the waves of thought. It's recognizing that you're already the depth that cannot be disturbed by any wave. This identification with your deep and unchanging nature, this is the silent revolution. Kenji felt a fundamental shift in his understanding. During all these days, he had been trying to achieve special states of calm. Now he realized the true practice consisted of recognizing the calm that was already inherent to his deepest nature. Master, I can feel there's something in me that has never really been disturbed, even in the midst of my worst anxieties. Yes, that's your real self, unchanging, unconditional, always present. Thoughts come and go, emotions come and go, circumstances come and go, but this fundamental consciousness remains always equal to itself. The sun had risen enough for its golden light to completely illuminate the garden. In this light, even the leaves that had created so much chaos minutes before looked beautiful, as if they were part of a sacred dance. The true revolution, said Roshi as he prepared to leave, is not changing what appears in your consciousness. It's changing your relationship with what appears. When you recognize yourself as the unchanging conscious space instead of identifying with the changing contents of that space, you've completed the most fundamental revolution possible. And is this revolution permanent, Master? The revolution itself happens in a moment of recognition. But the remembering, maintaining yourself identified with your true nature instead of with temporary phenomena, this requires constant practice. It's like learning to walk. Once you know how, you never completely forget, but at first you need to pay conscious attention to not fall. As Roshi walked away, Kenji remained seated with the empty jar. But now his experience was completely different. His mind still had anxious thoughts, but he was no longer those thoughts. He was the conscious space in which they appeared and disappeared. This simple inversion of identification had completely transformed his relationship with his internal experience. For the first time, he viscerally understood that freedom didn't come from controlling or eliminating the contents of consciousness, but from recognizing himself as consciousness itself, which remained free regardless of what contents might appear in it. The silent revolution had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 8. The Awakening of Ordinary Emptiness. On the 8th morning, something extraordinary had happened. Nothing extraordinary had happened. Kenji awakened without spiritual fanfares, without special mystical experiences, without the dramatic sensation of transformation he had experienced in previous days. It was simply ordinary, and in this perfect ordinariness, there was a perfection that transcended any special experience he had had before. As he walked toward the garden, he noticed his steps were naturally silent, his breathing naturally calm, his mind naturally spacious. There was no effort involved, no conscious practice. It was as if after days of learning to swim, it had finally become something natural without thinking. The empty jar on the table now seemed like an old intimate friend. There was no dramatic mystery about it, no profound teachings to extract. It was simply what it had always been, an empty jar. And in this perfect simplicity, Kenji found the deepest teaching of all. "Good morning," said Roshi, appearing with his usual presence of effortless tranquility. "Good morning, Master," replied Kenji. Noticing his greeting arose from a place of complete naturalness, without the urgency to impress or the anxiety of being evaluated that had characterized his first days. They sat together in familiar silence, but this silence had a different quality. It wasn't the tense silence of someone trying to meditate, nor the special silence of altered states of consciousness. It was the ordinary silence of two beings simply being, as natural as the silence between breaths or the space between words. After a time that could have been minutes or an eternity, time had lost its usual urgency. Roshi spoke. "Tell me, Kenji-san, what have you learned from the empty jar?" Kenji contemplated the question, noticing no elaborate or profound answer arose. Instead, perfect simplicity presented itself. "That it's empty, master." Roshi smiled, and in his smile was the recognition of someone who sees his student has finally understood. "And what have you learned about yourself?" "That I'm also empty." "And how do you feel about that?" Kenji explored his internal experience honestly. Completely ordinary, completely natural, as if it had always been this way, but I simply hadn't noticed. "Perfect!" exclaimed Roshi with genuine joy. "You've reached the end of the spiritual path, the discovery that there was never a path to travel, never a destination to reach, never a you that needed to be improved or enlightened." He took the empty jar in his hands, but now his gesture didn't have the ceremonial air of previous days. He was simply an older man holding a simple object. "This jar," he said, "doesn't pride itself on being empty. It doesn't feel special for being able to contain water. It doesn't seek recognition for its capacity to reflect light. It simply is what it is, completely and without apology. This is the state of true awakening, being completely what you are without the need to be something else." "But master," asked Kenji with genuine but unhurried curiosity, "is this all? Aren't there deeper experiences, grander realizations?" "Oh, there are infinite possible experiences," replied Roshi. "You can have visions of gods. You can feel your consciousness expand to embrace the universe. You can experience ecstasy that makes you weep with joy. But all those are like decorations on this empty jar, beautiful, temporary, but no more essential than its fundamental simplicity." To illustrate his point, Roshi took some flowers that had fallen during the night and placed them inside the jar. It looked beautiful, decorative, special. "Is it more valuable now?" he asked. "It's more showy, but not more valuable," replied Kenji without hesitation. Roshi removed the flowers, leaving the jar empty again. Extraordinary spiritual experiences are like these flowers, beautiful ornaments that can appear in the space of your consciousness. But your value, your perfection, your freedom doesn't depend on whether they're present or absent. It lies in being the unchanging space that can contain both the presence and absence of any experience. Kenji nodded, feeling the truth of this not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived realization in every cell of his being. "Master, does this mean I no longer need to practice? That I no longer need to meditate? Does this jar need to practice being empty?" asked Roshi with a mischievous smile. "No, it simply is empty. But if someone fills it with mud, would it be useful to clean it? Of course. So it is with your practice. You don't need to practice to be your true nature, you already are it. But when you forget, when you fill yourself with false identifications, when you confuse yourself with the temporary contents of your consciousness instead of recognizing yourself as consciousness itself, then practices can be useful to remember what you never really forgot." He stood and walked toward the pond, where the first rays of sun were beginning to create a play of light and shadow on the water's surface. "Come here, Kenji-san. There's one last teaching." When Kenji approached, Roshi pointed toward the pond. "What do you see?" "I see water, fish, reflections of clouds, sunlight. And what makes it possible for you to see all this?" Kenji reflected. "My eyes, my mind. Deeper. What makes the experience of seeing itself possible?" Kenji explored more deeply his experience of the present moment. Gradually, he realized there was a pure and simple consciousness that was the prerequisite for all perception, but which itself was not perceived as an object. The consciousness that is seeing. But I can't see it directly because it's what's doing the seeing. Exactly. That consciousness that cannot be seen because it's what sees, that cannot be known as an object because it's what knows all objects, that cannot be experienced because it's what experiences everything. That is your true nature. Roshi knelt by the pond and gently touched the surface with his finger, creating small concentric waves. These waves appear in the water, but water doesn't become waves. Waves are simply water moving. In the same way, all your thoughts, emotions, experiences, even your sense of being Kenji the monk, are waves in the ocean of consciousness that you are. They appear in you, but you don't become them. And this consciousness that I am, Master, does it have any particular quality? It has all qualities and no qualities, replied Roshi enigmatically. It's empty like this jar. It has no content of its own, but can contain any content. It's silent like space. It makes no noise of its own, but allows any sound to appear. It's unchanging like a mirror. It's not altered by what it reflects, but can reflect anything. They stood and returned toward the table where the empty jar waited, now glowing softly under the stronger morning light. Kenji-san, said Roshi with gentle formality that indicated something important was about to happen. Your formal training with the empty jar has ended. You have rediscovered what you never really lost. You have found what was never really lost. You have awakened to what was never really asleep. He took the jar in his hands and offered it to Kenji. This jar has been my teacher for more years than I can remember. Now it's yours not as possession, but as reminder. When you forget your true nature, when you get lost in the drama of experience, when you begin to believe again that you are the temporary waves instead of the eternal ocean, simply look at this empty jar. Don't try to extract profound teachings from it. Don't seek special experiences. Simply observe its ordinary emptiness and remember your own ordinary emptiness. Kenji received the jar with deep gratitude, but a gratitude as natural as receiving a gift from a dear friend. There was no pomp or ceremony in the moment, only the simple recognition of a complete transmission. Master, he said, what do I do now? How do I live from this understanding? You live exactly as you've been living, but from a different place. You continue sweeping corridors, but now you know the one who sweeps is as empty as the space being swept. You continue studying sutras, but now you understand the words arise from the same silent source as your understanding of them. You continue interacting with other monks, but now you recognize in them the same empty consciousness you've discovered in yourself. And if I forget, if I fall back into old patterns of identification, then you forget, said Roshi with warm laughter. So what? The sky doesn't stop being sky because clouds temporarily cover it. Your true nature isn't damaged because you temporarily forget it. Simply use forgetting as an opportunity to remember again. Each moment of remembering is fresh. Each rediscovery of your true nature is like the first time. The sun had risen enough for the entire garden to be bathed in golden light. Colors were vibrant, sounds clear, and there was a quality of immediate presence in everything he perceived that was extraordinary in its perfect ordinariness. One last thing, said Roshi as he prepared to leave for the final time from these morning sessions. Don't turn this understanding into a new identity. Don't become Kenji the Enlightened instead of Kenji the Seeker. Both are just temporary waves in the ocean of what you really are. Remain empty of fixed identity, free from any self-image, open to being completely new in each moment. Yes, Master. Thank you for guiding me home. I didn't guide you anywhere, smiled Roshi. I simply helped you notice where you were already standing. The home you found is the home you never left. The peace you've discovered is the peace that was always your nature. The freedom you've realized is the freedom you fundamentally are. As Roshi walked away for the last time, Kenji remained seated with the empty jar, but he was no longer a student contemplating a teaching object. He was empty consciousness recognizing itself in the form of an empty jar, recognizing itself in the form of a young monk, recognizing itself in the form of an old master walking away, recognizing itself in the form of a garden bathed in morning light. There was no separation between observer and observed, between consciousness and its contents, between emptiness and form. Everything was a seamless dance of the same fundamental reality, appearing as multiplicity but being fundamentally one. Kenji finally stood, holding the empty jar with the same natural care one holds one's breath. Neither too tight nor too loose. He walked back toward the monastery, but each step was a step taken by no one in particular toward nowhere specific. It was simply the movement of life itself, expressing itself as steps, as breath, as the continuous experience of being completely ordinary and completely awake. The formal training had ended, but true life lived from the direct understanding of one's own empty nature, was just beginning. And in this life, each moment would be an opportunity to remember what can never really be forgotten. That the spiritual search ends in the recognition that there was never a seeker, never anything to seek, and never a moment when you weren't completely free, completely whole, completely awake in the ordinary emptiness of your natural being. The empty jar had fulfilled its purpose. Now everything in Kenji's life, every task, every encounter, every moment, would be another empty jar. Another silent reminder of the simple and extraordinary truth of his unchanging nature. The ordinary life of extraordinary emptiness. Years later, Kenji, now a master himself, sits each morning with his own empty jar. Students come and go, each discovering for themselves that what they seek is already what they are. The jar remains empty, the teaching remains silent, and awakening continues to happen as it always has. Not as a dramatic event, but as the simple recognition of what has never been absent. In the perfect simplicity of the present moment, everything is complete. In the ordinary emptiness of consciousness, all seeking finds its natural end. And in the empty jar that rests serenely on the bamboo table, the wisdom of all Zen masters continues teaching without words, guiding without effort, awakening without drama those who are ready to discover they are already awake. The story ends, but the understanding it points to is timeless, always available, always present, patiently waiting to be recognized in the silent heart of anyone who takes the time to simply be empty, like a jar that contains nothing and therefore can contain everything. The end. Final reflection for the listener. As these words fade into the silence from which they arose, the silent invitation remains. Can you find that empty jar within yourself? Can you recognize the conscious space that is reading or listening to these words? Not as a concept, but as the living reality you are right now, have always been, and will always be, empty of limitations, free from identifications, complete in your natural simplicity. Kenji's story is your story. The empty jar he found is the same empty jar you are. The awakening he experienced is happening right now, not as something future to achieve, but as the present nature of your most intimate experience. Empty your mind not by forcing it to be empty, but by recognizing the emptiness that's already there. In that recognition, all seeking finds its natural culmination, and ordinary life reveals itself as extraordinarily perfect, exactly as it is.